October 14, 1943, the crisp autumn air clung to the streets of New York City, carrying with it the distant echo of a world at war. The German generals had arrived, a carefully selected delegation of high-ranking officers whose reputations preceded them in both fear and awe. They stepped off the train at Penn Station, their boots clicking against the polished floors, eyes scanning the foreign landscape with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Each carried the invisible weight of years of indoctrination, molded by Goebbels' relentless propaganda portraying America as a decadent, fragile nation, soft and unprepared for the storms of war. From the very first glance, the city refused to conform to their expectations. The streets teemed with organized chaos. Cars hummed past streetcars. Pedestrians maneuvered with practiced efficiency, and skyscrapers stretched toward the sky with a confidence that seemed almost defiant. The generals exchanged quiet, incredulous glances. In Berlin, they had been told that Americans lived in indulgence and ignorance, that their industries were inefficient and their people weak. Yet here, under the autumn sun, they witnessed a society that pulsed with discipline and purpose, a vibrancy that defied the caricatures painted in Nazi newspapers. As they were escorted through the city, American soldiers in crisp uniforms lined the streets, standing at rigid attention, their rifles gleaming in the morning light. The generals could not help but notice the meticulous precision. Every salute was exact, every step synchronized. The grandeur of the display was unmistakable, but it carried a different weight than the intimidating spectacle they had envisioned. There was order, yes, but there was no fear. The Americans did not try to terrify, they impressed, the car carrying. The generals weaved through streets lined with banners proclaiming unity and resolve. Citizens, though curious, kept their distance, giving the officers space to absorb their surroundings. The generals' faces, stern and unreadable, betrayed flickers of doubt, an internal questioning that they had been trained to suppress. The anticipation was palpable. The Americans had prepared a welcome that was meant to impress, but whether it would awe or unsettle them was a question that even the hosts could not answer. Their destination loomed ahead, an imposing government building, its stone facade both elegant and formidable. Inside, preparations had been underway for weeks, each detail meticulously planned, from polished silverware to perfectly arranged floral displays. The generals were ushered into a reception hall that shimmered with chandeliers, the scent of fresh linens mingling with the faint aroma of roasting meats from an adjacent dining area. It was everything they had expected in grandeur, but not in the way they anticipated. The environment carried confidence, competence, and a subtle power that was utterly foreign to them. As they paused at the threshold, the generals could feel the tension coil in the air, a nervous curiosity mingling with the pride of the hosts. Each officer silently wondered, would this first meal, this seemingly simple dinner, confirm the lies they had been fed, or would it quietly unravel the carefully constructed image of America that Goebbels had so meticulously painted? The answer, they had no inkling, would come with the first bite. The generals were led down a long, polished corridor, their boots echoing with an almost ceremonial cadence. The walls were adorned with portraits of American leaders, faces stern yet confident, each frame a silent assertion of a nation's resilience. The air carried a quiet tension, punctuated only by the muffled hum of conversation and the faint clinking of glass from the dining hall ahead. They had expected pomp, perhaps even gaudy displays of wealth meant to overwhelm, but what awaited them felt different, calculated, precise, and quietly imposing. The dining hall opened before them like a scene from another world. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, catching the light in a dazzling display. Long tables stretched across the room, draped in immaculate white linens, each place meticulously set with gleaming silverware and fine china. Centerpieces of autumnal flowers added a touch of elegance without excess. The generals, trained to perceive ostentation as weakness or a distraction, could not reconcile what they saw. This was not decadence, it was control, order, and an unmistakable confidence in subtlety. Waiters moved like shadows along the edges of the room, trays balanced expertly in their hands, a quiet hum of professionalism permeating the atmosphere. Each dish was a study in presentation, thick cuts of roast beef glistening with a caramelized crust, bowls of fresh vegetables arranged with geometric precision, sauces poured with an artistry that made the generals shift in their seats. They had been trained to expect that power was demonstrated through aggression, through spectacle. Here, power was in mastery, in the deliberate attention to detail, in the silent assurance that every element was perfect. As they were seated, the generals exchanged measured glances, attempting to mask the flicker of confusion that passed over their faces. The headwaiter approached, a calm and polished man who introduced the evening's menu with practiced eloquence. Oyster soup to start, followed by prime rib with a rich Bordelais sauce, seasonal vegetables, and a selection of desserts, designed to impress without indulgence. Each item seemed innocuous enough, yet to the generals it was a challenge. The menu alone hinted at a sophistication they had been led to dismiss. Dinner began with a ceremonial toast. Glasses of sparkling wine were raised, and the Americans' polished accents filled the room with cordiality. The generals, stiff and precise, mimicked the gesture, their minds racing. Every movement, every expression of politeness was scrutinized and weighed against the narratives they had known. Goebbels had promised a nation fraught with weakness, a people incapable of discipline or refinement. And yet here they were, confronted with the exact opposite. Americans who moved with purpose, spoke with confidence, and demonstrated respect without servility. The generals' unease grew as the courses arrived, each plate more artful than the last. They had been prepared to resist a culture they deemed inferior, to stand tall against mediocrity, yet subtle cracks began to appear in their mental armor. The soup, delicate and perfectly balanced, left them uncertain. The roast, tender and rich, demanded attention not as sustenance but as a statement. The Americans were not attacking, they were asserting dominance through skill, through the quiet power of refinement. The generals had no strategy for this. It was not the battlefield, it was an arena of perception, and they were unarmed. Whispers between officers betrayed their inner conflict. They are organized, one murmured under his breath, eyes scanning the room. Another shook his head slightly, attempting to maintain composure. Their expressions hardened, but their movements slowed ever so slightly, betraying a hesitation that had never been there before. For the first time, the generals were confronted with an enemy that was neither visible nor violent, an opponent that operated through subtlety, culture, and competence. As the last of the main course was served, a quiet realization settled over the generals. This dinner, meant as a display of courtesy, was already beginning to undermine the worldview they had carried with them from Berlin. Every dish, every gesture, every precise detail challenged the narrative they had internalized. For years, their preconceptions were crumbling, not with a loud explosion, but with the careful, deliberate precision of a masterful chef's knife, slicing through propaganda one subtle layer at a time. And as the Americans moved seamlessly to serve dessert, the generals were left with a lingering, unspoken question. Could something as simple as a meal reshape their understanding of power, of culture, and even of the war itself? In the tension-filled silence that followed, each officer grappled with the thought that this dinner was more than sustenance. It was a test, and they were unprepared for the lessons it would deliver. The silverware felt heavier than expected in their hands, as if the weight itself carried an unspoken challenge. The first course arrived: oyster soup, delicate and steaming, its fragrance unfamiliar and slightly bracing. The generals hesitated, each studying the bowl as though it were a tactical map. They had been trained to recognize weakness in extravagance, yet the presentation here was precise, almost austere in its elegance. The aroma hinted at freshness, a meticulous attention to detail that clashed with everything they had been taught. About American cuisine, General von Richter, a tall man with sharp cheekbones and an even sharper gaze, lifted his spoon with mechanical precision. The soup touched his lips, and for a fleeting moment the world seemed to pause. The taste was subtle, layered, and balanced, unexpectedly refined. His brow furrowed, an involuntary sign of confusion. It is well made, he muttered, almost to himself, his voice low, as if acknowledging a truth he was reluctant to admit. The generals around him exchanged cautious glances, none daring to speak too loudly. As the soup disappeared, the next course arrived, thick cuts of prime rib, glistening with a caramelized crust, surrounded by a medley of vegetables that looked more like art than sustenance. The portion sizes were generous but measured, designed to impress without overwhelming. The generals, accustomed to rigidly portioned rations, found themselves silently questioning the strategy behind such abundance. Each bite revealed layers of flavor-rich, juicy, and nuanced. Von Richter's jaw tightened, an almost imperceptible sign of disbelief. They season with precision," he whispered, eyes darting around the table. "Another general?" Von Langen cleared his throat, attempting to mask the mixture of awe and suspicion in his expression. A slight comedic undertone began to emerge as the generals navigated this unfamiliar territory. Forks were held awkwardly, knives hesitated mid-air, and a minor clatter of silverware punctuated the tense atmosphere. One general, trying to cut a particularly tender piece of meat, paused mid-motion, clearly unsure if he was committing some breach of etiquette. A faint smile flickered on the waiter's lips, unnoticed by the officers, who were too engrossed in the silent struggle between expectation and reality. Their rigid, militaristic training clashed spectacularly with the simple act of dining, turning what should have been an ordinary meal into a psychological battlefield. The aroma of roasting meats, mingling with the scent of fresh vegetables and carefully prepared sauces, filled the room. Each bite seemed to assert a quiet dominance, a subtle reminder that skill and refinement could hold power as surely as a rifle or a strategic maneuver. The general's whispers grew more frequent, fragments of doubt threading through their conversation. "They are efficient," von Langen murmured, eyes narrowing slightly. "Too organized. Too precise." The words were barely audible, but their meaning carried weight. For the first time, the veneer of American weakness was cracking. Dessert arrived with a flourish, individual tarts filled with rich, creamy custard, topped with glistening berries. The colors were vivid, the textures inviting. Even the generals, trained to resist indulgence and remain austere, hesitated. Von Richter lifted the spoon, paused, and then tasted. A moment of silence followed. Then, almost imperceptibly, his eyes widened. "Remarkable," he muttered, voice hushed, as if admitting to himself a truth that he had fought to deny. Around him, the other generals mirrored the reaction, each grappling with the unexpected pleasure. The undeniable craftsmanship before them, these small moments, the hesitations, the whispered acknowledgments, the fleeting expressions of wonder humanized the generals in a way that the rigid lines of military discipline never could. Their confidence, forged in years of battlefield experience and ideological certainty, was quietly challenged by something as ordinary yet as extraordinary as a meal. They were forced to confront a reality that propaganda could not reach. Americans were not the decadent, weak caricatures they had been taught to fear or dismiss. They were competent, meticulous, and capable of subtle power that required no threats, no overt displays of force. By the time the main courses had been cleared, a subtle shift had occurred at the table. The generals sat a little straighter, but their minds were unsettled. They whispered, exchanged glances, and measured every gesture. Something as simple as taste, texture, and presentation had begun to penetrate the armor of ideology. Their world, carefully constructed through years of indoctrination and propaganda, was cracking not with a bang, but with the quiet, insistent pressure of reality. As the Americans began serving dessert, the generals' internal unease deepened. Every bite, every flavor, every delicate arrangement of food seemed to carry an unspoken message. Power could exist in refinement, in precision, and in culture itself. The first bite had been more than sustenance. It was a revelation, a subtle shattering of preconceived notions. And as von Richter looked down at his tart, savoring the complex blend of sweetness and freshness, he could not suppress the growing awareness. The war, the enemy, the world itself was not as simple as he had been taught to believe. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it would grow, quietly but relentlessly. As the meal continued, the moment the dessert plates were cleared, a silence fell over the table that was heavier than any gunfire the generals had ever heard. The Americans, polite and composed, continued their conversation with measured civility, their smiles steady, their eyes attentive but relaxed. The generals, however, were caught in a storm that no battlefield could have prepared them for, a storm of realization that struck deeper than ideology, deeper than strategy, and far beyond the reach of Goebbels' careful fabrications. General von Richter sat back in his chair, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. The meticulousness of the meal, the precision of the service, the confidence with which the Americans carried themselves, it all pressed upon him with undeniable clarity. For the first time, he could not dismiss their competence as luck, as accident, or as a mere facade. Every detail of the evening, from the perfectly timed courses to the flawless manners, revealed a culture of discipline, resourcefulness, and resilience that propaganda had painted as non-existent around him. His fellow generals struggled with the same unspoken truth. Von Langen's hand trembled slightly as he poured himself a final sip of wine, a gesture he would normally perform with mechanical assurance. His eyes darted around the room, searching for some hint of weakness in the Americans, but found none. The city outside, glimpsed through towering windows, pulsed with energy, commerce, and purpose, a living testament to a nation that was neither decadent nor helpless. Von Langen exhaled sharply through his nose, almost a hiss, as though to dispel the cognitive dissonance that threatened to destabilize him. Whispers emerged, quiet but charged, as the generals attempted to process what they were witnessing. This is impossible," von Richter muttered under his breath. "They are efficient, too efficient." Another voice, quieter and more tense, added, "Our assumptions, our plans, if they operate like this—" Their sentences faltered, unfinished, each officer grappling with the creeping realization that the image of American weakness had been a carefully constructed lie. Their world, meticulously ordered in black and white, was dissolving into a spectrum of uncertainty that no one had taught them to navigate. The Americans, for their part, were blissfully unaware of the inner turmoil they had provoked. They maintained the illusion of normalcy with effortless grace. Their laughter was light, their conversation benign, yet every gesture, every perfectly measured courtesy underscored a quiet superiority that the generals could neither confront nor escape. Dramatic irony hung in the air like a charged current. The hosts played their roles impeccably, unaware that each polite smile and flawless pour was unraveling the mental armor of their guests. General von Richter's face betrayed a subtle, almost imperceptible flush. Embarrassment mingled with fear, not the kind born of threat or violence, but the deeper, more disorienting fear of being wrong, of having been deceived by the very ideology that had defined his life. He remembered Goebbels' proclamations, Americans weak, unprepared, decadent. And now, in the glow of chandeliers and amid the hum of polite conversation, every lie lay exposed. The generals had been trained to command, to strategize, to dominate, but here the battlefield was cultural, psychological, and entirely uncharted. Von Langen cleared his throat, a strained sound that seemed far louder than intended in the hushed room. "Perhaps we underestimated them," he said, words cautious, measured, as though speaking them aloud could solidify their truth. A brief exchange of glances followed. No words necessary, the collective understanding settled among them. Their assumptions, their confidence in the narrative of German superiority had been deeply shaken. The emotional tension was almost unbearable. Pride wrestled with fear, and loyalty to the right collided with the undeniable evidence laid out before them. Each dish, each gesture of hospitality had chipped away at the fortress of certainty they had carried from Berlin. The generals who had faced mortal danger on countless battlefields now found themselves confronting a far more subtle adversary, the truth, and it was disarming in its quiet, insistent power. As the Americans rose to bid them farewell, the generals struggled to conceal their inner upheaval. Politeness dictated bows, handshakes, and murmured expressions of gratitude. But each movement felt heavier, more deliberate, weighed down by unspoken realizations. Von Richter's mind raced, calculating, analyzing, yet increasingly unable to reconcile what he had been taught with what he had experienced. His fingers flexed around the chair arm, as though bracing himself against an invisible force that threatened to topple the familiar hierarchy of his beliefs. The Americans escorted the delegation to their waiting cars, all smiles and courteous words, completely oblivious to the psychological victory they had achieved. The generals were left with annoying unease, a sense that something fundamental had shifted, not in the world outside, but within themselves. Goebbels' carefully crafted illusions had been shattered, not with bombshells or speeches, but with food, service, and culture. By the time the cars rolled through the city streets, the generals were silent, lost in thought. Every glance, every gesture, and every memory of the meal pressed upon them. The stark contrast between expectation and reality had revealed a truth more formidable than any weapon. The Americans were organized, resourceful, and resilient. And now, the seeds of doubt, planted delicately over the course of a single dinner, were beginning to take root, threatening to reshape not only their perception of the enemy, but the very confidence upon which their obedience to Nazi ideology had been built. The generals returned to their seats after the Americans had momentarily stepped away, leaving the table quietly immaculate. The soft clinking of silverware being cleared and the faint scent of dessert lingering in the air created a strangely intimate atmosphere. For a moment, the rigid structure of protocol seemed to fall away, replaced by a rare space for contemplation. Each officer sat upright, maintaining the formal posture expected of their rank. Yet beneath the veneer, uncertainty simmered. Von Richter stared down at his empty plate, the memory of the meal pressing uncomfortably against the narratives he had clung to for years. He recalled the precise aroma of the oyster soup, the tenderness of the roast, the artistry of the vegetables, and the delicate sweetness of the custard tart. Each dish had been meticulously prepared, yet there was no ostentation, no attempt to intimidate, only mastery. The realization gnawed at him. This was a nation capable of refinement, efficiency, and subtle power, all of which challenged the very foundation of what he had been taught to believe about the enemy. His eyes flicked toward von Langen, who sat with a stiff jaw, one hand brushing the crumbs from the edge of his napkin. The general's expression was a mixture of irritation, disbelief, and something that looked dangerously close to awe. They operate with purpose, von Langen muttered under his breath, as if testing the words in the safety of the quiet hall. Every gesture, every dish, it's deliberate, calculated. His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a revelation that had quietly dismantled the ideological armor they carried with them. The conversation, cautious and measured, began to unfold in whispers. Von Richter leaned slightly closer to von Langen, lowering his voice. We have been told Americans are weak, undisciplined, incapable of serious thought. He paused, swallowing hard. But what we have seen tonight, they are neither weak nor foolish. The words felt foreign, almost heretical, even to himself. There was a fleeting moment of discomfort as both generals acknowledged a truth they had long avoided confronting. The world was not as black and white as Nazi propaganda had claimed. As the murmurs continued, a subtle humor began to emerge, a small relief amidst the tension. Von Langen allowed himself a faint, almost imperceptible smile as he recalled his awkward first attempt at cutting the prime rib. I almost dropped my knife, he admitted quietly, shaking his head. And yet they did not flinch, did they? Calm, unshaken, almost amused by our ineptitude. The irony was not lost on them. The Americans had executed perfection with ease, transforming even minor errors into silent lessons of skill and poise. It was a stark contrast to the general's rigid, militarized mindset, where mistakes carried consequences far graver. For the first time, the generals found themselves questioning more than their culinary competence. They questioned the very narratives that had defined their loyalty and strategic outlook. Goebbels' proclamations, once absolute, now seemed fragile in light of this simple, controlled display of American competence. The meal had illuminated a dissonance they could no longer ignore. The enemy's humanity, their discipline, and their ingenuity were undeniable. And with that awareness came an unsteady, creeping vulnerability, a sensation foreign to men who had long believed in their own unquestionable authority. Von Richter's hand drummed lightly against the edge of the table, a nervous tic he would have previously suppressed. "Do you think they know?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do they understand how deeply, how subtly they have undermined the image we carried of them?" Von Langen shook his head, brow furrowed. "No," he said. "They act with confidence and courtesy. They do not need to reveal their power. It is inherent in everything they do." The words, simple yet profound, resonated with an unsettling weight. The generals, for all their years of training and battlefield experience, were confronted with a challenge that could not be fought with guns, strategy, or ideology. The tension lingered even as the conversation waned. Each general retreated inward, reflecting on what had just occurred. Thoughts of propaganda, battlefield victories, and national pride collided with the undeniable reality that they had underestimated their supposed enemy. The meal, so ostensibly mundane, had cracked the armor of certainty, leaving an uncomfortable void where confidence had once resided. Pride wrestled with doubt, authority with uncertainty, and each officer was forced to acknowledge a subtle but persistent fear that the narrative they had trusted and the ideology they had upheld might not withstand the scrutiny of reality. In the quiet aftermath, a faint sense of camaraderie began to emerge among them, not in triumph, but in shared disquiet. They had survived battles, endured loss, and led men through chaos, yet here they were humbled by an experience devoid of violence, yet fraught with revelation. The Americans' composure, their skill, and their silent assertion of dominance had left an indelible mark on the minds of the generals. And though they maintained outward composure, their inward world had shifted irrevocably, leaving them to wrestle with a newfound vulnerability, that would echo far beyond the confines of this dinner table. As the last traces of the meal were cleared and the generals prepared to depart, the weight of reflection settled heavily upon them. Their loyalty to the Reich remained, yet it was tempered now by uncertainty. Each man left the table with a private question echoing in his mind. If reality could diverge so sharply from propaganda in something as simple as a meal, what other truths lay hidden beyond the veil of lies they had been taught to trust? The question remained unanswered, lingering like the final, faint aroma of the custard tart, a quiet reminder that perception and reality were not always aligned, and that the mind, once open to doubt, could never return to complete certainty. News traveled quietly at first, carried in whispers and careful observations, but its ripple through the corridors of power was inevitable. American intelligence officers, stationed discreetly near the reception and observant of every nuance, began to piece together the reactions of the German delegation. Their reports, initially phrased with clinical detachment, hinted at something far more consequential than mere diplomacy. The generals had arrived confident, imperious, and steeped in the ideology that had guided the Reich for years, but they had left the table visibly unsettled. Their composure strained, their gestures tighter, their glances sharper yet searching. Back in Washington, analysts noted the significance. The meal, meant as a ceremonial gesture of hospitality, had become an unintentional instrument of psychological strategy. It was almost imperceptible, no declarations, no threats, no military posturing, but the effect was unmistakable. Even the most casual observer could see that the generals were not just eating. They were absorbing, measuring, and contending with a reality that conflicted directly with the propaganda they had internalized. The Americans recognized the subtle power of cultural diplomacy, that sometimes influence was conveyed not through armies and tanks, but through careful attention, quiet confidence, and unexpected competence. Word of the delegation's reactions inevitably reached Germany, though filtered and reshaped by layers of official channels. The reports, when they arrived, spoke of minor irritations, of generals' hesitations, of discussions that hinted at unexpected impressions rather than outright admissions of doubt. Yet those who understood the psychology of the officers recognized the weight behind these phrases. A single meal, served with precision and grace, had begun to plant seeds of skepticism among men who were considered pillars of Nazi ideology. The subtle erosion of confidence, carried home in whispers and private correspondence, threatened to undermine the carefully cultivated morale that Goebbels had propagated for years inside the American command. Strategists discussed the implications over maps and reports. They underestimated the significance, one officer noted, tapping the edge of a chart with measured force. It wasn't just food, it was perception, order, discipline. They were confronted with evidence of efficiency, competence, and confidence without intimidation. That realization will stay with them. There was a quiet satisfaction in the observation. The general's worldview, once rigid, had been disrupted not by bombs or espionage, but by subtle, human interactions. The psychological impact of this dinner could reverberate through planning. Rooms, strategic calculations, and private councils in Berlin, influencing decisions in ways that no battlefield encounter could. The generals themselves were unaware of the extent of the reverberations their reactions had created. In their minds, the meal remained a personal ordeal, a private confrontation with reality that challenged every assumption they had carried from Germany. Yet outside observers began to speculate, if men of such rank and experience could be unsettled by something as simple as cuisine and decorum, what might that imply about the greater war effort? The narrative that the Reich had built an image of unassailable superiority was already fraying, and the cracks were spreading across the Atlantic. Rumors whispered through the halls of power, carried by diplomats, informants, and intelligence officers alike. Each account emphasized subtle details: the general's hesitation before tasting the dishes, the barely perceptible shifts in their posture, the occasional furrowed brow, the quick exchange of uneasy glances. Each of these observations, while small in isolation, formed a composite picture of disquiet, of ideological tension unraveling quietly but steadily. The propaganda that Goebbels had poured into the minds of millions was now under assault not by speeches, but by reality, experienced firsthand by men entrusted with upholding the Reich's narrative. Historians would later note that the dinner, unassuming as it appeared, represented a turning point in the psychological theater of the war. While tanks rolled across Europe and battles raged on distant fronts, the subtle, almost imperceptible challenge posed by a single evening meal left an indelible mark on perception. It demonstrated that influence could be exercised through civility, competence, and culture, and that even the most seasoned officers could be unsettled when faced with a truth that contradicted everything they had been taught. In the days that followed, American intelligence carefully monitored the delegation, noting the continued unease in private conversations and occasional reports back to Berlin. Each observation reinforced a growing awareness: perception, once challenged, could not easily be restored. The generals' confidence in Nazi narratives had been compromised, their certainty shaken, and their understanding of the enemy irrevocably altered. What began as a simple dinner had evolved into a subtle psychological blow, one whose implications could ripple far beyond the walls of the dining hall. By the time the generals returned to Germany, they carried with them more than memories of a meticulously prepared meal. They carried doubt, hesitation, and the unsettling knowledge that the enemy they had been trained to underestimate was competent, organized, and resilient. In the larger scope of the war, the dinner had become a testament to the power of human perception, an event that demonstrated how a single, carefully executed experience could challenge ideology, influence morale, and subtly reshape the course of a conflict long before bullets were fired. The generals stepped out into the crisp evening air, their footsteps heavier than when they had arrived. The streets of New York stretched before them, glowing with the amber light of street lamps and the steady pulse of a city alive and unshakable. They had come expecting to assert dominance, to see the decadent weakness that Goebbels' propaganda had promised them. Instead, they were leaving with a quiet, gnawing, uneasy recognition that the narrative they had trusted, the ideology they had carried into every battle and briefing, had been quietly dismantled. Von Richter walked in silence. the memory of the dinner pressing on his mind. Each course, each subtle gesture of the hosts replayed with unnerving clarity. The Americans had not sought to humiliate or intimidate. They had only been themselves organized, competent, and effortlessly composed. And yet that simple humanity had been enough to shake the general's certainty, enough to cast a shadow over the foundation of beliefs they had relied on for years. Von Langen, beside him, shifted uneasily, glancing at his colleagues with the faintest flicker of doubt in his eyes. The rigid confidence that had defined them on the battlefield was gone, replaced by something far more unsettling, the recognition of vulnerability. As their cars carried them away, the generals could not help but replay the events of the evening. The precise seasoning of the soup, the tender, perfectly cooked roast, the understated elegance of the dessert, all had been lessons in subtle power, in influence that did not rely on threat or coercion. They had faced armies, endured sieges, and commanded men under fire, yet the greatest challenge of the night had been entirely human. A meal had revealed what bombs could not, the resilience, resourcefulness, and competence of an entire nation. It was in that quiet reflection that the true magnitude of the evening became apparent. Goebbels' narrative, carefully constructed and relentlessly propagated, had been undermined not by combat, not by espionage, but by the ordinary, everyday excellence of a people simply living with precision and dignity. The generals had been confronted with a truth that was both simple and profound. Reality, when experienced directly, could dismantle even the most persistent lies. And once that realization took root, it could not be ignored or unlearned. By the time they reached their lodgings, the change in demeanor was unmistakable. Their faces, usually set in the rigid masks of command, now showed hints of reflection, of hesitation, of questions unspoken aloud. In private conversations and later reports, their words would carry an undercurrent of doubt, a subtle acknowledgement that the enemy was not as the Reich had claimed. The shift was imperceptible to outsiders, but for those who understood, it signaled a psychological ripple that would extend far beyond a single evening. History, in its quiet and unpredictable ways, often hinges on small moments. A meticulously prepared dinner, a gesture of civility, a subtle assertion of competence. These were the tools that had quietly shattered propaganda and challenged ideology. The generals, changed by something so human and so ordinary, became a testament to the power of reality to confront illusion, the vulnerability of certainty, and the profound influence of small, deliberate acts. And as the city lights faded behind them, the lesson lingered. Sometimes the most significant victories are won not on the battlefield but at the table, where perception meets truth and ideology meets reality.